up, everybody? I'm Dr. Regina Bradley, and this is Outkasted Conversations number 36. And I've been waiting for this one. This one's been a year in the making because she's just such a big deal. Dr. Brittney Cooper, what's going on, Professor Get Your Way? How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I know that you got big things popping, and everybody want a little bit of your time. So you know what you got to do to get into the club. How did you become Outkasted?
Yeah, so Southern Realistic Cadillac Music is my album. It's my joint. It came out when I was in middle school. I was in 8th grade. I'm a Southern girl, and in that moment in hip hop, folks, everybody was trying to figure out what side were they on? Were you East Coast? Were you West Coast? But I grew up listening to Two Live Crew and Scarface and the Ghetto Boys, and so listening to Southern rappers and then a lot of folks from the local New Orleans scene. And so when I heard Southern Playalistic, it sounded Southern to me. I knew that they were from Atlanta. It made sense to me sonically. So every night they would play Southern Playalistic on the radio, that or Players Ball, and so I would dance in my room, and it was really important to me as like a 13, 14-year-old kid, because I was dealing with a lot of teasing in school and kids saying, "Oh, you're not black," because I was a nerd. I was a black girl nerd, and it was like my one moment every day of joy and of unequivocal blackness, right? Like you listen to OutKast, and for me, they signal unequivocal blackness that's rooted in Southernness and rooted in pleasure. So, so that's how I became Outkasted, and I've been down with them ever since. So
whether you knew it or not, Crunk Feminist Collective and what you guys do with digital media is one of the inspirations for doing this Outkasted project and using digital spaces to think about ideas of black folks, Southern folks in these digital spaces, because so often we're pushed out of them, like we're not supposed to be in them anyway. Right. But yeah, I'm curious, to hear your thoughts a little bit about, what are the connections you think between ideas of technology and how technology plays out in OutKast work? Something that immediately comes to mind for me is synthesizer. On Aquemini, and I'm, as a digital media specialist, which you are, you know what I'm saying? What do you think those connections are, and why is that important to how we understand their work?
Right. So let me back up and say, one of the things that's sort of most important about OutKast is, so there's this Southern study scholar named Leanne Duck that talks about how the South temporally is always figured in the nation as in the past, as retrograde, and as taking up space. And that narrative also has adhered in hip-hop, particularly in the early 1990s. The South was seen as lagging behind. And so when OutKast blast off with this album, they sort of blast hip-hop into the future in all kinds of ways, and they set a new frame for thinking about all of the kind of possibilities about how hip-hop would meld music, and about saying, so one, they sort of reclaimed the dominance that Southern black culture had in African American literature, and say, we haven't lost that aesthetic. But the other that they do on a track like Synthesizer, and which they're also doing a little bit, so that's Aquemini, but they're doing this, I think, when I went back to listen to Southern Playalistic all the way through, I thought, well, this sounds a lot like, it's like a continuation of what Snoop and Dre are doing with the G-Funk era, right? So they both take that G-Funk sound, but it's sort of deeply Southern inflected and rooted. And so they take that kind of Afrofuturism that you see coming out of Parliament Funkadelic, but the radicalism of that argument is they say the South is not backwards, the South is not behind, the South is ahead. The South is ahead of the curve and is pushing this culture, which in that moment is in a battle for what its identity would be after the Far Side, after Tribe Called Quest, after De La Soul. It's the height of that moment, right? So that's one thing. Another thing that Synthesizer really makes me think about. So George Clinton is funny, right? Because he keeps on referencing times like that little ditty from Good Times, right? So it is indicative of, it is very much of the moment. It's that early 90s throwback to the 70s, but it's also so it anchors them, right? It creates a genealogy for them that they also reference in Spodioti. But at the same time, it sort of says, we're taking this past into the present and we're creating a sort of new future. So they both play with the notion of what a synthesizer does in terms of how it sonically sounds, but I think that they're also asking us at a meta level to see them as the group that comes along and synthesizes all these disparate cultural and musical traditions within hip-hop, which is really nice.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. As you know, I mean, my nickname for you is Professor Get Your Life, but you are all love. But you are very staunch Black feminist. I think it's really dope what you're doing with the work in terms of trying to, to borrow from Joan Morgan a little bit, make it a little bit grayer because of the complexities of living in this moment and being a Black woman and all these multiple instances. But one of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about, especially, is the work that you do surrounding gendered violence and Blackness, right? This idea of including women in these larger conversations that are taking place about the violence that is put in and put out of the African American community. So I was wondering, how does OutKast fit into that conversation? Because there are multiple instances of emotional violence, physical violence that they talk about, but aren't necessarily part of a larger conversation taking place. So what's your take on that?
Sure. So it's interesting, right? Because OutKast largely exists for me in the space of pleasure, and also to a certain extent in the space of political critique. Yeah. So I think a couple things. One is that the sound that they helped to pioneer, that kind of Atlanta sound, has been really central to my own sense of like my own political articulation, right? So it's the work we do at Crunk Feminist Collective. It's rooted in that kind of aesthetic. And even though we reference a lot Lil Jon, they're sort of the more serious, multi-layered, syncretistic backdrop to how we think about crunk and the possibilities of it. But I also think that, so for me, there are these sort of deeply political moments that emerge. It's like the call on Aquemini for liberation, right? It's the, that's liberation and baby, I want it, right? It's like a go-to track for me. Because it's not just the sort of overt political hip hop, but it's a call in Southern culture in a moment when folks don't think it's particularly political to say, at an affective level, this is the thing that I deeply desire and that I'm trying to make clear through the music. But then you also have these sort of hilarious gendered moments on these albums too. So one of my all-time favorite tracks is actually the random I'll Call Before I Come on. And it's because I love Gangsta Boo. So me and the co-founder of the CFC, my wonder twin Susanna Morris, always, are like, Gangsta Boo is our girl, right? And so there's that. And there's the sort of clear sexual pleasure of it. There's so there's that. But but then there's a more serious one like Toilet Tissue, right?
Right.
So OutKast is interesting because they seem very interested in all these different facets of Black life, like not just it's that early moment on Southern Playalistic where they say, look, like if you think that this is just weed smoking and you think it's just Cadillacs, it's the work we're doing here is so much more than that. And so you get a kind of political articulation on Toilet Tissue that I think is an update of Brenda's Got a Baby but is sort of rooted in the South. And is about Black girl abjection and invisibility. So the thing to say about them is I don't know how you square that with like Big Boy's clear pimp aesthetics that just come through over and over again, right? So for me, I don't know that they're sort of redeemed on the Gender Project just because they clearly are attuned to all these facets of community, but it's nice to have those moments. And it's nice that what I do feel when I listen to OutKast, in spite of the pimp aesthetics, is that there's a real value for Southern Black girls and how they get down. There's a way that they see Black girls. So there's a value not only for their bodies, but for their humor. for the sort of sonic folksiness of their voices, right? So you hear them on these various interludes on the phones and things of that nature, in these conversations. So I appreciate that, because you just hear black girls coming through, and you hear black men acknowledging, unlike in some early forms of hip hop, that black women are a part of their cultural landscape on the day-to-day. And I actually think that that's very important.
Yeah, I mean, I just really, it's just one of those things that it's something that we've been talking about pretty much the whole year, is this idea that, the South does go on after, the 1968 question, you know what I'm saying? And having these spaces where I don't always have to be a good, clean Christian girl, right? To be able to be protected is something that I really appreciate about OutKast's work. And even as an archive, if you will, of what the 90s did for Southern blackness, especially young Southern black folks, is important. What about kind of push the envelope a little bit? What about now? You know what I'm saying? Like, what do you think their significance is how we understand young black women and black girls in the South now?
Yeah, interesting. Wow. I mean, so I was listening to them and not wanting to turn off any track, right? I was like, let me listen to the whole corpus again. You gave me an excuse to do that. And I'm still struck by how, even though we haven't had a joint cast album since 2000, 2001, I mean, they have Speaker Box for Love Below in Idlewild, but we haven't had Dre and Big Boy doing what they do for a decade and a half nearly. And yet I'm struck by how much it still seems ahead of its time. And so that I don't think that the culture has actually risen to the level that they set for us, which is perhaps why they haven't felt the need to put out another kind of album, because I think they set a tone and said, these are the places we need the conversation to go. And I don't know that we have caught up. And so, I mean, in terms of what it means for black women in the culture, I mean, one of the things is, I mean, look, I've written about this. It bothers me that, like, Iggy is the voice of women rappers coming out of the A right now, right? That she has sonically co-opted that black female sound. So you listen to OutKast, and black women's sonic, just relationship to the everyday and the way it appears there is celebrated, right? So it's not showcased necessarily, but it is celebrated as part of the, like, kind of synthesized landscape that in conceptual universe in which the music exists. And I think that there's been a real dumbing down or emptying out of that, right? So even in a world where you don't necessarily see black women doing all of the rapping, I think that there's been a narrowing of how hip hop culture thinks about possibility for black women, or how they should show up. So they just show up as folks to be pimped, or as, or they show up really ornamentally, right? In a way that is just not true for OutKast, in an album that's about two dudes doing dude shit, very much so. Like, I don't, I can listen to that album and feel pleasure and not feel unseen or devalued, even when they say misogynistic things, and Big Boy is chief among them. But, so I think that there's a narrowing. But I think that at the same time, like I don't think that we can discount. Like, for me, there's still the future of where hip hop has to go. I think that's the thing. I listen to them and I still hear future. I don't hear past. I don't concede that, even though it came out 15 years ago, it's the same thing that they're doing with P-Funk, right? And then with G-Funk is saying, we don't concede that this is the past, right? This is very much the landscape on which we create. So I think that we have to rise to the occasion that they set for us. I think that they're sort of still very far ahead of where we're trying to get to. And I think if ever we meet that challenge, maybe they'll feel compelled to, like, create more work. Yeah,
I definitely think I'm also in that camp that I don't necessarily need a new cast album after this reunion tour, because I'm still trying to chew on and think through, the other albums they had before the reunion tour. But when you were talking about Iggy Azalea, that also made me think about how not only is it women that are being cast to the margins, but specifically Southern Black women. You know what I'm saying? In hip hop, especially when one of the most prominent tropes for Southern Black women is hypersexuality. You know what I mean? And I wrote a little bit about this because of the Pleasure Ninjas and all that other stuff is. And it wasn't necessarily to be exploitative. You know what I'm saying? It wasn't necessarily, oh, I'm sexualized, I'm a victim. I don't have any control over that. So when I think about, songs like Mamacita, for example, and one of my favorite caskets of all time is Kim and Cookie. You know what I'm saying? Right before that, and even thinking about Gangsta Boo's connection to that, just trying to reclaim a space for contemporary Southern Black women to talk about sexuality in ways that aren't necessarily connected, nor do they need to be connected to this previous kind of and revered narrative about Southern Black women's sexuality. I agree, right? I just feel like there was room to play around and be messy with it. In ways that I wonder if OutKast was still active, how they would be in conversation with folks like Iggy Azalea, and what that means. Got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, well, because I think that they what I'm thinking about is the art that used to accompany these albums, and so you would see the really thick-thighed, thick behind, dark skin, natural haired, sisters in their album art, right? So there was a celebration of in the Southern parlance we would say she's she's healthy, right? She's thick and healthy. So there was a celebration of the Black female body at every level of their music. So the visual art that accompanied it in that sort of moment when Dre is doing more, like he's doing more visual art or whatever and making that available, you see that kind of form celebrated. And then in the sort of amazing skits, and again, I mean, you just hear Black women sort of show up, right? Mm-hmm. On songs there. So one, I don't think they would be here for Iggy. I think she would probably get the side eye. I think, but I think the challenge is that what we have to recognize is that even though they celebrated Black women, part of this is about the fact that then the sort of corporate structure didn't make Black women to exist, and that's the void into which Iggy Azalea is able to come in and appropriate. But yeah, I mean, I hear that album and I just think that they're like Black men who are sort of actually interested in the universe of Black women and what they think and what moves them. There is an emotional complexity to OutKast that, and look, I don't think you get that kind of emotional complexity. I mean, it's like our friend Kiese always talks about, like the emotional complexity that we see at the heart of Black culture and in Black music is largely embodied through Black women, not because they're more emotional, but because we have had the space epistemologically to cultivate emotional complexity. And I think that part of the reason that OutKast emerges as feeling so emotionally complex is precisely because their landscape is not all dudes, right? And so I think that even though they do it largely, it reads as a sort of multi-layered and full sense of possibility or what Southern Black cultures look like, and that's interesting too when you think that they have a sort of far more complicated multi-layered rendering of Southern Black culture than somebody like Tyler Perry, who is very much interested too in the Southern landscape of Black identity, right? And so I have other issues with Tyler, but these are two portraits that I hadn't thought to connect until I'm sitting here talking to you. But they sort of get the emotional complexity of it and the humor of it, and the futuristic possibility of it in a way that I don't know that even Tyler Perry sees. So, yeah.
Yes, ma'am. All right, Glory. Well, I mean, if they don't know how to get in touch with you, Dr. Cooper, how can they get in touch with you and what you got going on and all that other good stuff?
Yeah, so at Professor Crunk on Twitter is a real good way. I'm just on the teaching grind, finishing up my book, Race Women, and still trying to make it happen at Salon and at Crunk Feminist Collective, which is, so deeply tethered to Southern hip hop and I think is part of the intellectual legacy of OutKast. So I'm really glad that I got to talk to you today.
Well, I appreciate you for checking in with us and everything.
Yes, thanks for having me.
No problem. I'm Dr. Regina Bradley. This is Outkasted Conversations. We'll holler at y'all next week. Y'all be easy.